Hello YouTube. Tamriel is full of factions, from the really well known ones like the Fighters Guild and the Mages Guild to pretty obscure ones like the House of Reveries. Now today I wanted to take a look at some of Tamriel's more obscure guilds, because while everyone knows about the Fighters and Mages Guild, there are far more guilds in the lore than you would think. Now quickly before we start, I am curious, let me know in the comments of this video which of these guilds you would one day like to see brought into the games. Really curious about that one. And also let me know what kind of quests you would like to see for that guild. Alright, let's roll the intro and let's talk about some obscure guilds. So, obscure guilds. Something you need to know is that most of the Tamriel-wide guilds, or at least Empire-wide guilds, got their start back in the Second Era with the signing of the so-called Guild Act, which famously brought the Mages Guild and Fighters Guild to life. The Guild Act was primarily meant to give the Fighters Guild an official role in the Tamrielic Empire as dependable mercenaries who could be hired to protect local cities and kingdoms. You see, back in the Second Era, under the rule of the first Akaviri Potentate, there were a lot of rebellions in the Empire, and the Potentate spent years campaigning with the Imperial legions to quell those rebellions. Now, during the height of all those rebellions, the Potentate instituted a new law which disbanded all local armies, with only city and town garrisons seemingly exempt from this law. Of course, this caused for a lot of unrest and even more rebellions, as local lords of the Empire refused to give up their standing armies. This led to a 37-year-long civil war within the Empire, in which the Akaviri Potentate used the Imperial legions to completely crush all local armies until the Imperial Legion, so the army of the central Imperial government, was the only serious fighting force left within the Empire's borders. However, this ultimate victory came at a big cost, as the bloody civil war had left Tamriel ravaged, and the lack of local standing armies gave bandits virtually free reign over much of the Empire's outer provinces, and the Imperial Legion was already spread too thinly to really deal with them. This is when the Guild Act was passed, a new law which sanctioned guilds in the Empire of certain professions that had to pay a certain percentage of their profits to the Imperial government in exchange for official Imperial recognition. The main objective of this law was the creation of the Fighters Guild as dependent Empire-wide mercenaries that the local lords could hire to deal with the bandits roaming around their land instead of having a standing army. But an unforeseen consequence of this act was the creation of many more guilds around Tamriel, which followed a similar model to the newly created Fighters Guild. While the Mages Guild is the biggest and most well-known example of this, we have many more. For example, there is the Merchants Guild, which loosely unites the merchants and shopkeepers of local towns, enforcing rules upon them such as universal opening times of their shops, and most likely also the prevention of pricing wars between competing merchants in the towns where the guild is active. You also have several guilds pertaining to the entertainment sectors of the Empire, such as the Actors Guild, which unites the actors of regions and which itself produces plays and seems to educate aspiring actors. The guild also recommends and reviews non-guild plays and performances for the public, and will even warn the public about really bad plays, although I can also see a bit of protectionism in that, as the guild might just negatively review almost anything made outside of the guild, but we don't have much evidence for that. Now, other than that, in the entertainment sector, you've also got the Minstrels Guild that we practically know nothing about, other than that it employs minstrels. And another very interesting guild that we know of is the Scenarists Guild, which interestingly is one of the few guilds that has operated around Tamriel since before the Guild Act. The Scenarists Guild has their own headquarters in an ancient citadel on the border between Hammerfell and Skyrim, and they mostly employ writers and historians, with a lot of cities having an outpost of the guild. The members of the Scenarists Guild in a city outpost are known to do research and write history volumes on the local area, but also offer their services to the local population and even to tourists, providing historical tours and lectures about the city that they reside in or the region that they reside in, when people want to learn about local history. Funnily enough, they also keep themselves busy by trying to solve riddles and puzzles, which is very cool, I guess. Now, kinda similar to them is the Scribes Guild, of whom we know next to nothing. However, if I had to guess, the Scribes Guild most likely unites local scribes that do administration, while the Scenarists Guild seems to be more like a historian's guild, if that makes sense. Now, next up we have a lot more traditional service professions that have their own guilds. So you've got a cook's guild, a brewer's guild, a cobbler's guild, a laborer's guild, a tailor's guild, a weaver's guild, a vintner's guild, an astrologer's guild, a barrister's guild, a caravanier's guild, a mason's guild, and a tinker's guild. Of many of those we know quite little. In fact, of the Cooks Guild we only know that they employ local cooks. Of the Cobblers Guild we only know that they employ shoemakers. Of the Brewers Guild we only know that they employ brewers. Of the Tailors Guild we only know that they employ those who make clothes. The Vintners Guild employs those who make wine. The Astrologers Guild employs astrologers. The Barristers Guild employs lawyers and other illegal experts. The Caravaneers Guild employs trading caravan owners and workers. The Masons Guild employs masons and other builders, and the Tinkers Guild employs those who work with tin. That's really all we know about them. The only one of those artisan guilds that we know a little bit more about is the Weavers Guild, and then specifically we know only about them that other than employing fabric makers, they were well known for producing the best quality fabrics around the continent, and that in some regions they had a near monopoly on the trade of fabrics. That's all. Now, next to those mentioned guilds, we also have a Rat Catchers Guild, pretty funny that you need a guild for that, and a Furriers Guild, not a furry guild, but a Furriers Guild, which are fur merchants and those who can work with fur and are able to expertly clean fur clothing. Cool. Now, while everyone knows about the Mages Guild, we know that there were some very specific other magical guilds on Tamriel, which mostly provided a very specific magical service as opposed to the Mages Guild, which had a more broad mandate about magic. For example, you had the Healers Guild, which specifically employed healing mages, and we know that there were specific smaller guilds for alchemy, but we don't know anything about those unfortunately. Now, a guild we do know a bit more about is the so-called Bailiffs Guild, a guild which educated and united the bailiffs of the Empire. By the way, a bailiff, for those who don't know, were usually local officials that can have a various range of responsibilities in towns and cities, usually acting as a proxy for the local lord in administration and justice matters for the people of the town or the city. And I presume that through this guild one could likely become educated to become a bailiff and then keep in contact with others of the profession across many of the towns and cities of Tamriel. Now, some ex-members of this city actually appeared in the Elder Scrolls Online's Thieves Guild DLC, meaning that actually Bethesda has not forgotten about all these obscure guilds. But other than that, we know, again, very little about this one. Now, a guild that we actually know a bit more of is the Prostitutes Guild, which I actually already talked about in my wider video on prostitution on Tamriel, which is in the description in case you want to know about it. Not a meme video, serious video. So check that out if you want to know more. Now, of the Prostitutes Guild, we know that it hires and protects the local sex workers of the different cities. Each chapter is led by a so-called guild mistress, and the guild does not just provide sexual services, but also apparently puts on large-scale dance and art shows and parades on large holidays, or at least in some of the bigger cities where they're active. Now, the final obscure guild that I want to talk about in this video is the Architects Guild. They employ architects across the Empire and apparently are somewhat uniformizing the building standards across the Empire. We also know that this guild is one of the bigger and better organized ones and is able to withstand large-scale civil wars with the parties at war, both trusting the guild to do work for them. Or perhaps they just have very little choice, as nearly every Tamrielic architect is apparently part of the guild. And that is basically all I can tell you about Tamriel's more obscure guilds. So let me know in the comments which one of these you actually still want to see in any of the games and what kind of quests they would have. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not give the video a like, as that's how YouTube's mighty algorithm decides what content is worthy and what content is not. Anyway, all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Doji, Hunter Joe, KLegendM, King Chris 20, RB Dash, Volkure of Argonia, Devin Mattingly, Rakai and Sordo Bushido. These people, along with all the others on screen, keep my channel afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably next week.